It began with a dream, a slow drifting memory of a road overgrown with weeds, twisting its way toward a house that no longer belonged to anyone. In the pale moonlight, Manderley appeared like a ghost, its windows shattered, its gardens wild, its walls heavy with silence. The gate stood open, as if still waiting for guests who would never return. The narrator's voice echoed softly in the dream. "Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again." The words were both nostalgic and haunting, like the first line of a story that refuses to die. Before Manderley became a ruin, it had been a world unto itself. The narrator, a young woman with little fortune and no title, had never imagined her life would cross with such grandeur. She was shy, often fading into the background, the kind of girl people overlooked in elegant hotel lobbies and crowded drawing rooms. She worked as a paid companion to Mrs. Van Hopper, a wealthy, gossipy woman who filled silence with scandal. Her life moved quietly, like pages turning in a forgotten novel, until she met him. Maxim de Winter. Maxim de Winter was unlike anyone she had ever met. Reserved, elegant, carrying an invisible weight in the way he moved through the world. He was a widower, known across Europe as the owner of Manderley, a legendary estate on the Cornish coast. Rumors followed him like shadows, of tragedy, of his late wife Rebeca's mysterious death. The young woman first noticed him at the Hotel Côte d'Azur, seated alone at a terrace table, staring out toward the sea. His presence was magnetic, drawing her into a world she didn't yet understand. Their first conversation was awkward, accidental. She had climbed onto a cliffside to sketch the view, only to find Maxim there unexpectedly, his expression caught between amusement and sorrow. He spoke with a kind of detached charm, as if polite conversation were a habit rather than a pleasure. She was nervous, stumbling over her words, painfully aware of her plainness compared to the glamorous women who usually surrounded men like him. Yet Maxim didn't dismiss her. He asked questions. He listened, and in that quiet something subtle began. In the days that followed, they developed a strange, gentle routine. Breakfast in the sunlit hotel dining room, drives through the winding roads above the sea. Conversations that revealed little but suggested much. He never spoke of Rebeca, but her name hovered in the air between them like perfume, lingering, unacknowledged. The young woman found herself looking forward to each moment with Maxim, even as Mrs. Van Hopper gossiped about him relentlessly. "He's broken," her employer would whisper, still haunted by her. But to the narrator, he simply felt real. Then came the news that shattered her fragile world. Mrs. Van Hopper announced suddenly that they were leaving for New York. The narrator felt her heart drop, not because of the destination, but because it meant leaving Maxim behind. She walked the hotel corridors that night, like someone drifting through the last act of a story that ended too soon. She told herself he would forget her easily. After all, who was she to him? Just a girl with no fortune, no name, no past worth remembering. The next morning, Maxim surprised her. Instead of saying goodbye, he invited her for one last drive. The sea mist hung low over the cliffs as they drove, the air thick with unspoken words. He parked near the edge and turned to her, his voice quiet but direct. "I hate being alone," he said. "Will you marry me?" She was stunned, certain he was joking, but Maxim's eyes held no trace of humor. In that moment, her life pivoted sharply, from a quiet existence to a path leading toward Manderley. Their engagement happened swiftly, almost absurdly so. No grand romance, no elaborate courtship. A decision made in quiet moments, rather than passionate declarations. She accepted not out of ambition, but out of something deeper, a belief that she had been chosen, finally seen. Mrs. Van Hopper was furious, of course, convinced Maxim had lost his senses. But the narrator, giddy and terrified, boarded the ship to England as Mrs. de Winter. She carried no jewels, no social polish, only a fragile hope that love would be enough. The journey to Manderley was long and filled with anxious anticipation. She pictured the estate based on stories she'd overheard. Grand halls, sweeping gardens, endless rooms filled with history. She tried to imagine herself as its mistress, but found the image absurd. She was clumsy, inexperienced, nothing like the poised society women she'd seen in magazines. But Maxim seemed calm, even relieved. He spoke little of the future, but his eyes softened when they met hers. She told herself love could conquer everything, even the shadow of a dead woman. When they finally arrived, Manderley rose from the mist like something half remembered and half feared. Towers and ivy, iron gates and gravel paths, a coastline that swallowed the horizon. The housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers, greeted them with a stare that could freeze water. Inside, the house breathed with history. Every hallway, every portrait, every polished surface whispered the same name, Rebeca. Though the new Mrs. de Winter stood at the threshold of her new life, she felt it immediately. She was stepping into someone else's story. Manderley was not simply a house, it was a world that had existed long before her and would continue long after. Its corridors were wide and hushed, lined with portraits that seemed to watch her every move. The rooms were vast, smelling faintly of polished wood, old roses, and the sea. Servants moved with silent precision, as if following a rhythm she couldn't hear. She walked through it all feeling like a child wandering into a cathedral. This was Rebeca's domain, even in death, and she was merely a guest. Mrs. Danvers watched her with the sharp, unblinking eyes of someone who missed nothing. Tall, severe, and dressed always in black, she carried an aura that made the young Mrs. de Winter's stomach knot. Their first meeting had been stiff, formal, but beneath Mrs. Danvers' polite words was something else. A quiet disapproval, a devotion to the past. She spoke of Rebeca with reverence, as if the dead woman were still alive, still just in another room waiting to return. Every word made the new bride feel smaller. Each room she entered seemed to whisper Rebeca's name. The morning room held freshly arranged flowers, Rebeca's favorite kinds placed in Rebeca's vases. The west wing remained untouched, locked in a kind of elegant stasis. Even the servants referred to Rebeca casually, as though her death had not removed her from the hierarchy of the house. Mrs. de Winter always liked it this way, they'd say, glancing at the new mistress with polite confusion, as if wondering why she hadn't learned the rules. Her husband, Maxim, seemed almost relieved to be home, though his eyes grew shadowed whenever Rebeca's name arose. He avoided the west wing entirely, dismissing questions with a brisk change of subject. Their breakfasts together were quiet, filled with the sound of distant waves and silver cutlery. He was kind to her, but distant, as though part of him existed elsewhere, somewhere she couldn't reach. She told herself it was simply his way, the habits of a man who had once loved someone extraordinary. But doubt lingered like mist. The housekeeper's power became more evident with each passing day. Mrs. Danvers glided through Manderley like a ghost who owned the walls. She corrected the new Mrs. de Winter gently, but with an edge that left her feeling foolish. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her mere presence was enough to remind the new bride of her own inadequacies. When Mrs. Danvers showed her Rebeca's handwriting on menus and instructions preserved in drawers, it felt less like guidance and more like a reminder of who truly ruled here. The young Mrs. de Winter tried to involve herself in the running of the house, but everything she touched seemed to unravel. She misordered flowers, sent the wrong menu to the kitchen, stumbled over social expectations. Even the guests who came to visit compared her to Rebeca openly, as if the comparison were inevitable. Rebeca always arranged it so beautifully, they would say, smiling with nostalgia. Their kindness only deepened her sense of inadequacy. She began to feel like an imposter, wearing another woman's name. One afternoon she wandered into the west wing, forbidden territory, drawn by curiosity stronger than fear. The rooms were immaculate, frozen in time, Rebeca's clothing still hanging in closets as if awaiting her return. A faint scent of perfume lingered in the air, haunting and delicate. Mrs. Danvers appeared silently behind her, her presence so sudden it made her gasp. "It's just as she left it," Mrs. Danvers whispered reverently. "I keep it ready in case she comes back." Her eyes gleamed with something unsettling. Mrs. Danvers began to speak of Rebeca with obsessive detail. Her beauty, her charm, her flawless sense of style. She showed the new Mrs. de Winter Rebeca's gowns, her brushes, her monogrammed handkerchiefs. She knew everything, Mrs. Danvers said softly. She was born to be mistress of Manderley. Her voice carried no malice, only conviction, and that was somehow worse. Standing in those rooms, surrounded by Rebeca's lingering presence, the new bride felt like a pale imitation of a woman she'd never known. From that day forward, the house seemed to close in around her. Hallways grew darker, the sea louder at night. She began to dream of Rebeca, not as a person, but as a presence, a force that lived in the walls. Even Maxim seemed affected, his temper flaring unexpectedly, his silences stretching longer. When she reached out to him, he would turn away with haunted eyes. She began to wonder if love alone could survive in a house built on memories too powerful to erase. The more she tried to assert herself, the more the house seemed to push back. Mrs. Danvers watched her like a hawk waiting for mistakes. Guests compared her to Rebeca. Servants followed old routines she couldn't change. And Maxim drifted further into his own silence. She felt herself shrinking, like a shadow beside Rebeca's towering memory. Manderley was beautiful, yes, but beneath its elegance lay something cold and unyielding. She had married Maxim, but she was living with Rebeca. The weeks that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Manderley moved like a machine she did not know how to operate. Guests came and went, servants followed invisible orders, and the gardens bloomed magnificently without her touch. She drifted through the house like a visitor rather than a mistress, smiling politely at people who spoke more of Rebeca than of her. Maxim was often away on estate business, leaving her alone in rooms that felt too large, too silent. She began to wonder if she truly existed here at all. Social expectations weighed heavily upon her. Invitations arrived in elegant envelopes, luncheons were planned, dinners arranged. Everyone expected her to step seamlessly into Rebeca's role, as though the name Mrs. de Winter itself carried a script she was failing to follow. She stumbled through introductions, faltered at hosting duties, and felt the quiet judgment of society's polished faces. Rebeca's reputation hovered over every event, like a chandelier threatening to fall. No matter what she did, she was always too shy, too awkward, too unlike her. Mrs. Danvers watched it all with quiet satisfaction. She never said anything openly cruel, but her every glance, every measured pause, seemed to underline the new Mrs. de Winter's inadequacy. She would correct her with that smooth, calm voice. Mrs. de Winter used to prefer it this way, turning even simple decisions into failures. She spoke Rebeca's name with reverence, her eyes shining with loyalty. It wasn't just service, it was worship. And the new bride was the unworthy intruder who had stepped into a cathedral she did not understand. Maxim suggested they host the annual costume ball, a grand event Rebeca had perfected in her time. The idea terrified her, but he seemed excited, almost nostalgic. "It will be good for the estate," he said, brushing off her hesitations. Guests from all over the county would attend, and she, as the new Mrs. de Winter, was expected to lead the night. The pressure mounted quickly. She tried to imagine herself as a glamorous hostess, but every attempt ended with Rebeca's shadow standing in her place. Mrs. Danvers saw her hesitation and seized it like a cat with a mouse. One afternoon, in the quiet of the West Wing, she suggested a costume for the ball. Why not wear something historical? Something romantic, she purred. She led her to a portrait on the staircase, a young woman in a white gown, flowers in her hair, serene and beautiful. "You'd look lovely dressed like her," Mrs. Danvers said. Her tone was smooth, persuasive. For the first time, the young Mrs. de Winter felt included in a vision she could almost believe in. She spent days secretly preparing the gown, excited for once to surprise Maxim. She imagined walking down the grand staircase, guests turning to admire her transformation. For a fleeting moment, she believed this ball might finally be her chance to step into her role with grace, to make Manderley hers. She practiced her smile in the mirror, rehearsed her walk. Mrs. Danvers watched from the shadows, expression unreadable. Outside, the estate was draped in lights and flowers, ready for a night that would be remembered. The night of the ball arrived, and Manderley glowed like a palace. Lanterns lined the drive, music floated through the halls, and guests in extravagant costumes filled the ballroom with color and laughter. Nervous but excited, she waited upstairs for her grand entrance. She wore the gown perfectly, her hair styled like the portrait subject. Her heart raced as she stepped onto the landing, descending the staircase slowly. For a single shining second, she felt beautiful, the mistress of Manderley at last. Then she saw Maxim's face. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs, pale and horrified. The laughter and music below seemed to fade into a dull roar. Guests turned to look at her, whispers rippling through the crowd. Maxim's voice cut through it all, sharp and shocked. "What the devil are you wearing?" She froze mid-step, confusion turning to dread as she saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't admiration, it was disbelief. The gown was not just historical, it was Rebeca's last costume, worn the night before she died. Humiliation washed over her like cold water. The whispers grew louder, faces turned toward her with pity and intrigue. She fled back upstairs, ripping at the dress as she ran, tears blurring her vision. In her room, she collapsed against the door, realizing the trap Mrs. Danvers had set. The suggestion hadn't been innocent. It had been precise, cruel. She felt foolish, exposed, a puppet dancing on invisible strings. The house echoed with music and laughter below, while upstairs she crumbled alone. Mrs. Danvers appeared in her room, silent as a wraith. Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "I only thought it would please Mr. de Winter," she said softly, her voice dripping with false innocence. She stepped closer, her presence suffocating. "You thought you could be her, but you'll never be Rebeca." The words landed like knives. In that moment, the young Mrs. de Winter understood fully. Manderley was not hers, and Mrs. Danvers would make sure it never would be. And somewhere in the house, Rebeca's presence seemed to laugh. The night of the ball lingered like a wound that refused to close. The music had ended, the guests had gone, but the humiliation still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying Maxim's horrified expression again and again. Downstairs, she could hear the servants clearing away decorations, their voices faint through the walls. Manderley seemed to hum with Rebeca's presence, as if she had orchestrated the entire evening from beyond. She felt small again, like the nameless girl she had once been. The next morning, Maxim was distant. He avoided her eyes at breakfast, answering her hesitant questions with clipped, distracted words. She tried to explain that she hadn't known the significance of the costume, but he brushed her off with a quiet, "Let's not talk about it." His voice was cold, heavy with memories she couldn't touch. She wanted to reach him, to remind him of their shared moments before Manderley, but between them now stood Rebeca, larger, louder, unyielding. The silence between them grew like a shadow stretching across the room. She wandered through the house that day in a daze, her footsteps echoing in hallways that no longer felt welcoming. The servants whispered behind her back. The guests' gossip would no doubt spread through every corner of society. Mrs. Danvers moved through the house like a triumphant spectre, her eyes gleaming when they met hers. Every object, every portrait seemed to mock her. She realized she had tried to step into Rebeca's image and had been destroyed by it. She didn't belong here. Perhaps she never had. That afternoon, she found herself drawn toward the West Wing once again. The rooms remained untouched, Rebeca's presence as vivid as ever. Mrs. Danvers was there, standing by the window that overlooked the sea, her black dress blending into the shadows. She turned slowly when the young Mrs. de Winter entered, a faint smile curling her lips. "You look tired," she said softly. "This house takes strength. Rebeca had it. You do not." Her voice was low, almost kind, but every word struck like a needle. Mrs. Danvers moved closer, her voice weaving a web of poison cloaked in calmness. "You thought you could take her place, but you're nothing like her. Everyone knows it. Even Mr. de Winter." She began describing Rebeca in vivid detail, her beauty, her confidence, the way she commanded a room. She spoke as if Rebeca was still alive just beyond the door, waiting to step back in. The young Mrs. de Winter stood frozen, the weight of every comparison pressing down until her breath came shallow and quick. Mrs. Danvers led her to the open window overlooking the sea. The wind whipped through, cold and sharp. "Why don't you go?" she whispered, her tone suddenly intimate, persuasive. "Why don't you leave Manderley? You don't belong here. He doesn't love you." "He loves her." She leaned closer, her eyes blazing with something almost hypnotic. "Go now, it would be so easy. Just lean forward. It would all be over." The words wrapped around her like a dark lullaby, pulling her toward the edge. For a heartbeat, she felt herself sway. The endless grey sea stretched below like a mirror to her despair. Mrs. Danvers' voice was soft, relentless. "There's no place for you here. There never was." She could almost believe it, that slipping away would bring peace, that she could free Maxim, free herself, free the house from this suffocating ghost. Her hands trembled against the windowsill. The sound of distant waves rose like a heartbeat. She closed her eyes and leaned forward just slightly. Then suddenly a loud explosion shattered the silence. The distant booming echoed across the coast. Both women turned sharply toward the sound. A rocket flare cut across the sky. A ship had run aground in the bay. The signal shot up in bright white streaks, snapping her out of Mrs. Danvers' spell. She stumbled back from the window, gasping, as the house came alive with shouts and hurried footsteps. Servants rushed past the courtyard. The Coast Guards were already mobilizing. The spell had broken, and for now, Mrs. Danvers watched her retreat with a mixture of fury and disappointment, like a spider whose prey had slipped from its web. "Coward," she whispered, though not loudly enough for anyone else to hear. She turned toward the sea with a gaze so intense it seemed she could command the waves themselves. The young Mrs. de Winter fled the west wing, her heart pounding. She didn't yet understand it, but the storm outside was about to uncover more than a shipwreck. Something buried deep within Manderley was stirring. As night fell, the estate became a hive of activity. Soldiers and coastguards filled the beach, lanterns flickering against the rising tide. Maxim was summoned to the cliffs, his expression unreadable. She followed quietly, her fear still buzzing in her chest. In the darkness, the wreck of the ship lay twisted against the rocks, but it wasn't the wreck that made Maxim's face go pale. Divers had found something else beneath the water, something that had been hidden for a year. Rebeca's boat, and inside a body. The discovery of the boat sent ripples through Manderley like a shockwave. Lanterns lit the shoreline, their flickering light casting long shadows across the cliffs. The body found inside had been preserved by the cold depths, identified by the remnants of clothing and Rebeca's monogrammed ring. It was undeniable. The woman buried months ago under her name wasn't Rebeca at all. Suddenly, the mystery that had lingered over Manderley returned with new, terrifying clarity. Maxim stood silent among the officials, his face pale, his hands clenched. Something inside him had shifted. News spread quickly. Servants whispered in corridors. Guests speculated in drawing rooms. The newspapers would soon have their turn. The young Mrs. de Winter watched Maxim closely that night, sensing an invisible wall crumbling. His usual detachment was replaced by something else, a raw, unsettled energy, as if a dam had cracked inside him. When they returned to the house, he didn't retreat into silence as usual. Instead, he poured himself a drink with shaking hands, staring into the fire like a man standing at the edge of a confession he could no longer avoid. She approached him cautiously, unsure of what to say. Before she could speak, he turned to her with a look she'd never seen in his eyes. Not coldness, not distance, but despair. "Rebeca has been found," he said quietly. She nodded, unsure what he expected. Then he added almost in a whisper, "I identified the wrong body." The words hung between them, heavy and strange. Her heart began to pound. Maxim sat down slowly, as if bracing himself against the weight of what he was about to reveal. "She wasn't drowned by accident," he said, his voice low and unsteady. "I killed her." For a moment the world seemed to tilt. She stared at him, waiting for the words to change, to mean something else. But Maxim's face was grave, his eyes locked on hers, pleading not for forgiveness but for understanding. He began to speak rapidly then, like a man who had held his breath for too long. The night Rebeca died unfolded through his words, not as rumor but as truth. Rebeca had been cruel, he explained. Behind her perfect social mask lay manipulation, deceit and malice. She had never loved him. She had mocked him, flaunted her affairs and turned Manderley into a stage for her lies. That night in the boathouse, she had taunted him with a final revelation. She was pregnant but not with his child. She claimed she would raise the child as the future heir of Manderley, trapping him in a web of humiliation. Something inside him had snapped. The struggle ended quickly. A single gunshot. He had placed her body in the boat, scuttled it deliberately, and then identified a stranger's corpse to close the chapter. He confessed this calmly, almost with relief, as though saying the words lifted an unbearable weight. The young Mrs. de Winter listened in stunned silence, but beneath the shock something unexpected stirred. She did not recoil. Instead, she felt the strange, fierce clarity of loyalty. For the first time, Maxim was not distant or unreachable. He was hers, vulnerable and human, stripped of pretense. "I thought you'd hate me," he said quietly, almost like a child. But she didn't. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with a wild sense of purpose. The house, the whispers, the humiliation, they all melted away in this moment. Rebeca's ghost no longer loomed above her, as an impossible rival. She was dead, and the truth was messy, imperfect, human. She took Maxim's hand and held it firmly, whispering, "I love you." The words surprised even her, but they anchored him. For the first time, their bond felt real. Outside, the investigation continued, the coroner's inquest looming like a storm on the horizon. Divers examined the wreck. Officials asked quiet questions. Soon others would demand answers Maxim couldn't conceal. But inside the walls of Manderley, something had shifted fundamentally. The young Mrs. de Winter no longer felt like an outsider in Rebeca's story. She had crossed a threshold into Maxim's truth, and with it came an almost reckless determination to protect him. The girl who once trembled in Rebeca's shadow now stood in defiance of it. The inquest was announced for the following day. Officials, journalists, and curious neighbors would gather to dissect Rebeca's death piece by piece. Maxim faced it with grim resolve, but now he was not alone. She was beside him, calm and composed, determined to match the strength of the woman she had once envied. Mrs. Danvers moved through the house like a silent storm, her expression hardening. She had lived worshipping Rebeca's perfection. The truth threatened to unravel the idol she had built. That night, as they prepared for what lay ahead, the young Mrs. De Winter looked out toward the sea. The wind howled against the cliffs, as if carrying whispers from that fateful night. She thought of Rebeca, beautiful, cruel, invincible, and realized that the power she had held over them was built on illusion. The truth, ugly as it was, had stripped Rebeca of her perfection. For the first time, the young bride no longer feared her name. She whispered it softly, not like a ghost's curse, but like a chapter finally turning. The inquest was held in a small courtroom in the nearby town, but the atmosphere was as intense as any grand trial. Reporters crowded outside, their cameras flashing as Maxim and his wife stepped out of the car. Inside, whispers spread like wildfire. Everyone knew the story of Rebeca de Winter, the radiant hostess of Manderley, the tragic wife lost to the sea. Now they had returned to dissect her death like vultures circling a carcass. The young Mrs. De Winter sat beside Maxim, her hands folded tightly in her lap, heart pounding. The coroner recited the details of the discovery with clinical precision. Rebeca's boat found on the seabed, the body inside, confirmed as hers by dental records and personal effects. The hole in the hull that indicated deliberate scuttling. Each fact landed like a stone in the hushed room. Maxim sat with unnerving stillness, his face carefully composed. But she could feel the tension radiating from him, each muscle in his arm rigid beneath his tailored suit. She wanted to reach for his hand, but dared not in front of so many eyes. Witnesses were called. Coast guards, divers, and villagers who had known Rebeca. Their testimonies painted her as graceful, beloved, full of life. They spoke of her charm, her beauty, her elegance. No one spoke of cruelty. No one spoke of secrets. To the public, Rebeca was a golden figure preserved in memory, untouched by truth. Each word built her myth higher, and Maxim's silence became heavier, like a man crushed beneath the weight of a lie he had chosen to live with. Then came the boat builder. His voice was rough but steady as he described Rebeca's boat, how she had insisted on taking it out alone that night, how the seacocks had been opened deliberately. That boat didn't sink by accident, he said, looking directly at the jury. The room stirred. Eyes shifted toward Maxim. The coroner leaned forward with interest, sensing the possibility of scandal. For a moment, the young Mrs. De Winter thought everything might unravel then and there. But Maxim remained composed, his gaze unwavering. The verdict, after long deliberation, was read out as suicide. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Suicide. It was both a relief and a complication. On one hand, it cleared Maxim of suspicion in the eyes of the law. On the other, it cast a strange shadow over Rebeca's legend. The beloved hostess had chosen death. The villagers struggled to reconcile the verdict with their image of her. Whispers erupted immediately, questioning, speculating, refusing to accept the possibility. Rebeca's myth was cracking, and cracks invite darkness. Back at Manderley, Mrs. Danvers received the news with a fury that burned quietly beneath her rigid exterior. Her devotion to Rebeca was absolute, and the idea of her mistress choosing suicide was blasphemous. She moved through the house like a storm contained within black silk, her eyes flashing with restrained rage. The young Mrs. De Winter sensed the danger, but couldn't quite name it. Mrs. Danvers was not a woman who accepted defeat. She was a woman who waited for opportunities to strike. Maxim withdrew into himself in the days that followed, exhausted by the ordeal. He sat for long stretches in his study, the firelight flickering against his tired face. For the first time, the young Mrs. De Winter felt like his equal, a confidant rather than an outsider. The confession had bound them together in ways neither could have predicted, but it had also placed a target on them. Rebeca's legacy, once untouchable, was now contested ground, and Mrs. Danvers would not let it go easily. The young Mrs. De Winter tried to assert her role more confidently. She walked the halls of Manderley with her head held higher, no longer trembling at Rebeca's name. She sat at Maxim's desk, sorted letters, made decisions. The servants watched her with cautious respect, some loyal to the living, others still whispering of the dead. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of power. Not borrowed, not imagined. Real power built on loyalty, truth, and shared secrets. But in the West Wing, Mrs. Danvers watched like a predator. Late one evening, she entered Rebeca's old room and found Mrs. Danvers there in the dark, staring at the sea through the open window. "She didn't kill herself," Mrs. Danvers said softly without turning. "She wasn't weak like that. Someone killed her." The words were delivered like a prophecy, low and unwavering. The young Mrs. De Winter felt a chill crawl up her spine. She opened her mouth to respond but found no words. Mrs. Danvers turned then, her face pale and fierce. "I'll prove it," she whispered. It was clear now. The house was no longer divided between past and present. It was a battlefield. On one side, Maxim and his young wife, bound by the truth and their fragile love. On the other, Mrs. Danvers and the memory of Rebeca, a ghost armed with whispers and devotion. The verdict had not ended the story. It had ignited a new conflict. And as the winds rose outside Manderley that night, the young Mrs. De Winter realized something chilling. The living were about to confront the dead's most loyal servant. The inquest's verdict did not settle the air at Manderley. It thickened it. Whispers persisted in the village. Guests exchanged meaningful glances. And inside the house, Mrs. Danvers moved like a silent storm. She no longer masked her disdain for the young Mrs. De Winter. Her glances were sharper, her silences heavier. It was as though the verdict had personally insulted her devotion to Rebeca. She had built her entire world around the perfection of her mistress. Suicide was not perfection, it was betrayal, and Mrs. Danvers would not let it stand. One grey afternoon, a visitor arrived unexpectedly. Jack Favell, Rebeca's cousin. His charm was slick, his smile too wide and his eyes calculating. He entered Manderley as if he owned it, nodding familiarly to the servants. The young Mrs. De Winter watched him with immediate unease. Favell carried with him the scent of cheap cigarettes and arrogance. He spoke of Rebeca casually, intimately, as if his relationship with her had been far closer than propriety allowed. His presence unsettled the fragile balance the household was clinging to. Favell requested to see Maxim, but his tone was not that of a guest. It was of someone issuing a challenge. He strode through the house, lingering in rooms that once belonged to Rebeca, commenting on the decor with a knowing smirk. "She had such exquisite taste," he said, eyes flicking toward the new Mrs. De Winter with pointed amusement. "A shame it's changed." His words dripped with implication. She sensed immediately that he was not here to mourn or reminisce. He was here for leverage. Mrs. Danvers greeted Favell with an almost feverish relief, as if an ally had arrived to restore order. They spoke in low voices near the West Wing, their conversations stopping abruptly whenever the young Mrs. De Winter appeared. She overheard fragments, whispers of Rebeca, of secrets, of a letter. Something was being plotted in the shadows of the house, and for the first time it felt like Rebeca's presence was no longer confined to memory. It was active, breathing through the people who loved her most. That evening, Maxim reluctantly met with Favell in the library. She sat nearby, heart pounding, listening through the open doorway. Favell's voice was smooth and mocking as he hinted that he knew Rebeca's death was not suicide. He claimed to have a letter she wrote to him the very day she died, inviting him to the boathouse that night. He implied that Maxim had reason to silence her. His smile never faltered, even as he accused. It wasn't grief he carried, it was blackmail. Maxim did not react as Favell expected. Instead of panic, he showed quiet fury. He called Favell's bluff, daring him to take his accusations to the authorities. Favell, amused, agreed. He contacted Colonel Julian, a respected figure in the area, to come to Manderley the next day to clear up a few matters. As Favell left, his smirk lingered like smoke in the room. The young Mrs. De Winter watched Maxim carefully. He was pale, tense, but no longer distant. The truth was coming whether they were ready or not. That night, the house felt more alive than ever, though not in any comforting way. The wind battered the windows, branches clawed against the glass, and in the West Wing a light burned late into the night. Mrs. Danvers paced like a creature trapped between loyalty and vengeance. She had pinned her entire existence to Rebeca's perfection. To see that image dismantled by the inquest, by Favell's hints, by Maxim's quiet defiance, it unmoored her. Her devotion began to twist into something volatile. The young Mrs. De Winter found Maxim in his study later that night. He sat by the fire, hands clasped tightly, staring into the flames. She approached him quietly, no longer the timid girl from Monte Carlo. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said softly, "we face it together." He looked up at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. She wasn't Rebeca. She wasn't a shadow. She was his ally. Something fierce passed between them. Not romance, but shared resolve. The next morning, Colonel Julian arrived with Fauvel, their presence heavy with unspoken accusations. The conversation began politely, but it didn't stay that way for long. Fauvel produced the letter, Rebeca's handwriting looping elegantly across the page. She had invited him to the boathouse that night, writing cryptically of big news. Colonel Julian turned his gaze toward Maxim, the implication clear. Rebeca had not intended to end her life. The walls seemed to tighten as everyone waited for his response. Maxim stood slowly, his voice steady but low. He didn't deny the letter. He didn't deny Fauvel's claims. Instead, he spoke plainly, recounting the truth of that night as he had told his wife. Rebeca's cruelty, the pregnancy lie, the fatal confrontation. Colonel Julian listened in stunned silence. Fauvel's smirk faltered for the first time. Mrs. Danvers, standing in the doorway like a shadow, watched her idol's perfection crumble. For years she had kept Rebeca alive through memory. Now in this room, the truth was breaking her ghost apart. The library had become a battleground. Maxim's confession hung in the air like thick smoke, and for the first time, Rebeca's perfection was being challenged in front of others. Colonel Julian sat stiffly in his chair, weighing every word, while Fauvel paced like a restless predator. He had come expecting to trap Maxim with scandal, to profit from Rebeca's death. Instead, he found himself face to face with a story of manipulation and cruelty that didn't fit the narrative everyone had cherished. His smirk had faded, replaced by sharp calculation. Fauvel demanded Maxim's arrest, his voice rising in feigned outrage. "He shot her and sank her body," he insisted. "You hurt him." But Colonel Julian was cautious. Something in Maxim's account had struck him as oddly plausible. The way he spoke of Rebeca's taunts, her manipulation, her threat about the child. Still, he needed proof. That was when Maxim mentioned a key detail Rebeca had revealed to him that night. Her mysterious visit to a London doctor earlier that same day. It had been the spark that lit everything aflame. Intrigued, Colonel Julian suggested they confirm Rebeca's medical records. A call was placed to the doctor's office in London, and after tense hours of waiting, the reply arrived by telegram. The room fell silent as Colonel Julian unfolded the paper and read it aloud. Rebeca had not been pregnant. She had been terminally ill, diagnosed with inoperable cancer. She had lied to Maxim about the pregnancy to provoke him, to drive him to the edge. The big news she wrote to Fauvel was likely her diagnosis, not a child. The revelation shifted everything. Suicide was no longer just plausible. It seemed inevitable. Rebeca had spent years constructing her perfect image, controlling every aspect of her life. Faced with the slow erosion of her body, she had chosen to die on her own terms, and in a way that would leave chaos behind. Maxim's act, while violent, was no longer easily framed as murder in the legal sense. Colonel Julian, a man of reason, understood what the telegram implied. Fauvel, however, was furious. His weapon had been blunted. Fauvel shouted accusations, waving Rebeca's letter like a flag, but the power behind his threats had evaporated. Colonel Julian dismissed him curtly, calling his motives transparent. He had come not for justice but for leverage, and he had lost. With nothing left to gain, Fauvel left Manderley seething, his plans in ruins. For Maxim and his wife, the danger of exposure had passed, legally at least. But inside the house, the storm had only just begun. Mrs. Danvers had listened to every word, her face pale, her eyes burning with something dangerous. For years, Mrs. Danvers had preserved Rebeca's memory like a shrine. She had believed in her mistress's strength, perfection, invincibility. To learn that Rebeca had lied, not only to Maxim but to her, to everyone, was a wound deeper than betrayal. The foundation of her devotion cracked. She wandered through the West Wing like a woman possessed, touching Rebeca's belongings, whispering to the air. She wasn't weak, she muttered. She wasn't sick. She couldn't be. The walls of her carefully curated world were collapsing. The young Mrs. De Winter watched her with growing unease. There was something brittle in Mrs. Danvers now, something unpredictable. She moved through the house at night, lighting no lamps, whispering to herself in Rebeca's rooms. Servants avoided her. Even Maxim kept his distance, sensing the danger of a loyalty that had nowhere left to go. Rebeca's myth had been shattered, but Mrs. Danvers had built her entire identity upon it. Without that myth, she was unmoored, a force without purpose. For Maxim and his wife, the revelation brought an unexpected closeness. The secrets had been dragged into the light, and for the first time they faced the future as partners rather than strangers living under the same roof. She no longer felt like a timid outsider. She had stood beside him through confession, inquest, accusation, and revelation. Together, they had survived the unraveling of Rebeca's legend. But they underestimated the depth of Mrs. Danvers' devotion and the destruction a devoted servant can unleash when her god dies. Mrs. Danvers spent hours alone in the West Wing, standing before the open window where she had once nearly pushed the new Mrs. De Winter to despair. Her black dress rippled in the wind, her hands gripping the windowsill. The sea roared below as if echoing the fury in her chest. She spoke aloud to the empty rooms, her voice trembling. "You are perfect. They can't take that from you." But her words sounded hollow now, bouncing back from walls that no longer held Rebeca's power. That night, as the household slept, Mrs. Danvers moved silently through Manderley like a shadow. Her footsteps left no sound on the stone floors. She passed the portraits, the flowers, the grand staircase, all the things Rebeca had once controlled. In her eyes, this was no longer Manderley without its queen. It was a desecrated temple, and she, its priestess, had one final act to deliver. Her devotion had nowhere left to go but into flame. She turned toward the West Wing, a strange calm settling over her. The night was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that feels deliberate. A pale moon hung over Manderley, casting silver light across the estate. The young Mrs. De Winter awoke to the faint scent of smoke drifting through her window. At first, she thought it was a dream, a lingering wisp from the fireplace downstairs. But as she stepped into the corridor, the smell grew stronger, acrid, sharp, undeniable. In the distance, faint orange flickers danced against the walls like restless spirits. Something was burning. She ran down the hallway barefoot, her nightgown trailing behind her. The house, usually so composed, felt alive with movement. Servants shouting, doors slamming, footsteps thundering through the halls. Maxim met her on the staircase, his face pale in the rising glow. "The West Wing," he said, breathless. Flames were spreading quickly, consuming curtains and wood paneling like dry paper. The wing that had belonged to Rebeca, her shrine, was aflame. It was as if the house itself had finally turned against its memories. Servants rushed with buckets of water, their efforts frantic but futile. The fire was too fierce, too deliberate. It had started from within, not by accident. Maxim barked orders, forcing the staff to evacuate, his voice echoing through the halls. She followed, choking on smoke, her eyes watering as embers floated through the air like fireflies. The house that had once intimidated her now seemed monstrous, groaning, crackling, collapsing under the weight of its own history. Rebeca's presence, once invisible, now roared through the flames. Amid the chaos, someone shouted that Mrs. Danvers was missing. A cold chill ran through her, even as the heat rose around them. She knew where Danvers would be. The West Wing, Rebeca's rooms. She pushed through the smoke with Maxim calling after her, his voice muffled by the roar of the fire. She found Mrs. Danvers standing before the open window, the flames crawling up the walls behind her. Her face was eerily calm, illuminated by firelight like a woman embracing her final truth. Mrs. Danvers didn't look at her at first. She gazed out at the dark sea, her hands resting lightly on the windowsill. "You've taken everything," she said softly, almost tenderly. "But you can't take her." She turned then, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made the young Mrs. De Winter take a step back. This house was hers. Every stone, every room, every breath. Without her, it's nothing. And now it will be nothing. Her voice was steady, almost serene. She had already made her choice. Flames surged through the doorway, framing Mrs. Danvers like a figure in some tragic painting. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with smoke. "Come with us!" the young Mrs. De Winter shouted, coughing. "It's not too late." But Mrs. Danvers simply shook her head slowly, almost pityingly. "Too late?" she whispered. "It's only just beginning." And with that, she turned back toward the sea as the fire consumed the room around her. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She let the house burn with her inside it. Maxim dragged his wife out just as a section of the ceiling collapsed behind them. Outside, the night sky glowed an angry red. Flames leapt high above the trees, sparks raining down like fiery snow. The villagers gathered at a distance, their faces pale, murmuring prayers as the great house burned. Manderley, the proud estate that had loomed so large over their lives, was reduced to a blazing silhouette. The west wing fell first, then the library, then the great staircase. One by one, Rebeca's domains were swallowed whole. They stood together on the lawn, smoke swirling around them. She clutched Maxim's hand tightly, their faces illuminated by the inferno. It was terrible and mesmerizing all at once, the destruction of a place that had defined their lives. The house that had been Rebeca's temple, Mrs. Danvers' shrine, their prison, was crumbling to ash. It felt as if the past itself was burning, every whisper, every portrait, every trace of the woman who had ruled it even in death. Mrs. Danvers' body was never recovered. Some said she perished in the flames. Others whispered that she walked into the sea that night, following her mistress into legend. It didn't matter. Her devotion had been absolute, and its final act had been destruction. As the fire died down near dawn, only blackened stone walls remained, jagged against a pink morning sky. Manderley was gone. Its power, its beauty, its curse, all reduced to smoke drifting over the sea. As the first light of day touched their faces, Maxim and his wife stood in silence. There were no words to capture what had happened. The house that had once stood between them was gone. Consumed by flames and loyalty turned to madness, Rebeca's ghost had been exorcised not by truth but by fire. They didn't turn back as they walked away. The smoke curled upward, disappearing into the morning, carrying with it the last remnants of a legend that had ruled them all. They left Manderley behind as the first pale light of morning touched the smoking ruins. The estate, once so imposing and alive with whispers, now lay blackened against the sky. As the carriage rolled away, she didn't look back, though the scent of ash clung to the air like memory refusing to fade. For the first time, there was no looming house waiting for them. No watchful windows, no ghost in the halls. The silence felt unfamiliar, almost hollow. Rebeca's world had ended, but what remained was still uncertain. Weeks turned into months. They drifted through small towns in the south of Europe, living quietly without friends or society. Maxim avoided the newspapers, and she stopped asking about England. They rented small houses with shuttered windows, blending into unfamiliar streets where no one knew their names. It was a strange kind of freedom, not joyous but weightless, like stepping out from under a shadow that had defined their lives. Manderley's grandeur had been replaced by the hum of distant markets and the sound of church bells at dusk. She became Maxim's anchor in this new world, as he carried the weight of his past in silence. His hair grew grayer, his manner quieter, his temper softened. Sometimes she would catch him staring out a window at nothing in particular, as if seeing the coastline in his mind, the house standing proudly once more. But he didn't speak of it. He rarely spoke of Rebeca anymore. Her name had become something unspoken between them, not out of fear, but because the fire had turned it into something final. For her, the transformation had been quieter but profound. She was no longer the timid girl who had arrived at Manderley overwhelmed and unseen. The ordeal had stripped away her innocence, but forged a quiet strength in its place. She learned to live in stillness, without the expectations of society, or the watchful eyes of a house built to glorify someone else. She tended small gardens, wrote letters that were never sent, and walked beside Maxim without the invisible third presence between them. At night, sometimes, dreams of Manderley returned. Not as nightmares, but as vivid echoes. Moonlight over the long drive, the whisper of the sea against the cliffs, the scent of lilacs drifting through the morning room. She would see Mrs. Danvers in her black dress, gliding through corridors, and Rebeca's laughter faint in the distance. When she woke, the quiet foreign rooms felt distant and strange. The house no longer existed, but in dreams it remained whole, preserved like a memory pressed between the pages of a book. Maxim rarely dreamed aloud, but on certain nights she sensed his restlessness. He would wake before dawn, pacing softly, careful not to disturb her. In those moments, she understood that Manderley lived inside him as much as it did in her, not as a place but as a weight carried silently. He had loved Rebeca once, or thought he did. He had killed her. He had lost everything that defined him. Now all that remained was the quiet life they built together on the ashes of the past. They lived simply, avoiding questions and strangers. Sometimes tourists passing through would remark on their British accents and ask where they were from. Nowhere in particular, she would answer with a small smile. It wasn't a lie. They belonged to no place now. Their lives had become a kind of limbo, suspended between the world that burned and the one they now inhabited. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, but it was real, and in its quiet, she found a strange peace. She reflected often on Rebeca, not with hatred, but with a kind of detached clarity. Rebeca had been brilliant, manipulative, alive. She had built Manderley in her image and ruled it absolutely. But she had also been mortal, fragile beneath the surface. Her lies had led to her end, and her perfection had been her downfall. For years, Rebeca had seemed like a ghost, too powerful to exorcise. But in truth, she had always been human. The fire had revealed that better than any confession. Sometimes she wondered if the fire had been inevitable, if Mrs. Danvers had merely lit the match on something that was destined to collapse. Manderley had been built not just of stone, but of illusions. When those illusions cracked, the house had followed. The fire had destroyed the walls, but also freed them from the endless comparisons, the whispered judgments, the gaze of a woman long dead. They had paid a terrible price, but in that ruin, something fragile and new had been born. Years later, when she told their story to herself in quiet moments, it always began the same way, with Manderley. Not with the fire, nor the confession, nor Rebeca's cruelty, but with the image of the long drive, overgrown and silent, leading to a house that no longer stood. She spoke of it like a ghost story, not with fear, but with reverence for what it had shaped in her. Last night, she would think, I dreamt I went to Manderley again. And though the house was gone, the memory lived on,